Clinton world and their enemies within the Democratic Party are engaged in kind of a family feud about whether or not they should relitigate Bill Clinton's past. This is what Josh Barrow of Business Insider titled his piece today. The Clintons held the Democratic Party hostage for 2 decades. Going on to write inside, the core problem is that the Democrats decided the Clintons were their people and then reasoned backward to their principles. So I have a question. Is it fair to argue that the GOP treated the Bushes the same way and that President Trump has wrestled the party back to its Reagan roots? Joining us now from Washington is Ronald Reagan biographer extraordinaire Craig Shirley, and from Austin, Texas, Mark Upgrove. He's the author of the new book, The Last Republicans, Inside the Extraordinary Relationship Between George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. It's great to see both of you.
Thank you. Let's
start with you, Craig, on this question of the legacy of the Bushes in the camp. Obviously, the Bushes didn't have their, the sexual scandals, other than the,
right.
I guess, the groping from the wheelchair rumor that we're hearing now. But they didn't have their sexual scandals. But nevertheless, there's clearly a break that has happened, for the most part,
Yes.
from the Bushes to the current Republican Party. Talk about that.
Well, the Bushes were always, Laura, an aberration to some degree. Look, George H.W. Bush was only president because he was Ronald Reagan's vice president for 2 terms. And in fact, a New York Times poll in 1988, after he beat Michael Dukakis, said that a majority of Americans voted him because they saw him as a continuation of the Reagan legacy. Obviously, he didn't continue that, and he pursued, basically big government republicanism, as did his son, George W. Bush. So they're both aberrations from the degree of the Republican Party, as the party's always traditionally been, at least in the modern era, for less government, more freedom, federalism, all those issues that animate Republicans centered on the principle of personal freedom, dignity, and rights. So there was kind of a natural exorcism that had to happen because they both ended up as perceived as failed presidencies.
And Mark, George W. Bush, whom I like very much personally, he left office with an abysmal approval rating. It was in the mid-20s by most accounts. The nation had turned against pretty much both wars in the Middle East. We had the mass economic collapse. He tried to push through immigration amnesty. That went down in flames. Harriet Miers, the Supreme Court, had to pull that back. We lost the House, we lost the Senate, and then we lost the presidency to Barack H. Obama. Yet in your book, you kind of make this argument that the Bushes are the real Republicans, and they're worried that that Trump will be the last Republican because he's not really a Republican. I find that analysis curious, given the carnage post-Bush to the Republican Party.
Well, I want to make clear that when I call them the last Republicans, that's really a type of establishment republicanism that the Republican electorate clearly rejected in the 2016 campaign cycle, to the surprise of everybody. And I think to a large extent, the Republican Party wanted to protect the establishment in the beginning of the cycle. They resisted the candidacy of Donald Trump. He won the nomination fair and square and went on to win the presidency. So there's no disputing that. But it is the end of a kind of republicanism where America was more engaged in the world.
Wait, hold on a second. The president just came back from this 12-day trip to Asia. He was in the Philippines, Vietnam, Korea, China. At the APEC summit, he went to Europe, talked about NATO. He went to talk to all the Muslim leaders. He went to Jerusalem. He went to meet the Pope. I mean, he's been around, and he wants to engage with the rest of the world. He just doesn't want us to be involved in endless wars, which in part helped elect Barack Obama. So the idea that he's some isolationist, that's ridiculous. That is such a Bush line, that, oh, he's an isolationist, he's a protectionist, he's a nativist. Those old tropes just aren't working anymore, Mark. And I think the more we hear them, the more people just start laughing when they hear them.
Well, I think that if you look at the Trump agenda, it was largely transactional. It was what deal can we get that's the best deal for America, and that's fine. I think the Bushes were pushing a different kind of agenda, a humanitarian agenda, human rights. You saw that.
It was a globalist agenda.
Well, that's
what
that's the term.
Open borders,
that's the term
open markets. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's the term that's used.
Craig,
and again, that's a very different kind of republicanism. Yeah.
It's focusing on America first. I want to play a soundbite from 1979. This is 1981, actually, from Ronald Reagan, for both of you, and have you quickly react. Let's watch.
It is my intention to curb the size and influence of the federal establishment and to demand recognition of the distinction between the powers granted to the federal government and those reserved to the states or to the people. All of us need to be reminded that the federal government did not create the states. The states created the federal government.
Craig, I watched that from the 1981 inaugural,
Sure.
and I stood at the president's grave tonight, said a prayer for him and Nancy, and thanked him for what he did for this country. I watched that, and I wonder, what would he think today about the state of the Republican Party and the state of this country?
Well, he was always a party man. Once he switched parties, and he supported Republicans, even those he didn't always agree with. But, you know, that soundbite reminds me of how Reagan was such a devotee of the Constitution, the Declaration. He started out became a child of the Enlightenment, believing that the man was more important than the state. And that statement about the states creating the federal government, that's right out of the Federalist Papers. It's right out of Madison, which he avidly read. He was a American conservative. He believed that power flowed upward from the people to the national government, as opposed to, say, like a British conservative who believes that power flows down from the institutions to the individual. He was very centered on the rights and dignity and privacy of the American individual.
Hey, Mark, do you think Ronald Reagan would tweet? If he was alive during Twitter, do you think he'd tweet?
No, I don't.
Yes, he would.
Ronald Reagan
we disagree. May I jump in here?
I'll make my point and then
Go ahead, Mark.
No, I don't think he would. Reagan was really about civility. And when he went to Washington, he campaigned against a big government. But government actually got bigger during the Reagan administration. There were 3 platforms he campaigned on. One was ending the Cold War by a clear American victory, which he achieved largely, or helped to achieve. He wanted to end big government. Government got bigger, and he wanted to restore the Americans' pride in their nation.
Mark, we're out of time. We're out of time. But he would have tweeted. He would have tweeted. Craig, why? Because he knew that was the people's medium. People's medium.
Because he loved technology. He mastered commercial radio in the 30s. He mastered movies in the 40s. He mastered television in the 50s and 60s. He loved technology, and he loved the ability to communicate his message to a widest audience as possible.
But he would have tweeted
Reagan was alive today.
He would have done it civilly.
He'd be using Facebook and he'd be using Twitter.
Yes, but he would have
maybe it wouldn't be just
civilly,
like Trump's tweets.
honestly.
Yeah,
No, it wouldn't be.
All right. Yeah, it would be. He'd tweet, and we'd all love the tweets, let's face it. Great to have you both on. Thank you so much.